Well, good evening, everyone, both those gathered here in the hall tonight and everyone watching in via our live stream. And welcome to our presentation this evening on Australia, Britain, and the coming World War. Well, what a state the world is in. Who would have thought that here, halfway through this year, we'd find ourselves in and out of lockdowns, stuck here in the state of South Australia, as our country, and indeed the entire world, grapples to handle a pandemic with all of its various consequences. And amid all of that, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, announces a $270 billion defence spending over the next 10 years. Why on earth is that? What's happening to our world? What's going to happen to my family? What's the future of tourism? What's the future of world trade? What's the future of international relations between countries like Australia and China? Are we headed for war? Are we headed for world war? Well, perhaps some of those questions have gone through your mind over the past few weeks and months. And if they have, well, you're certainly not alone. Well, why would you come to the Bible in search of answers for that sort of question? Well, I just want to say at the outset that we come here for solid, evidence-based answers. You know, I was recently asked at work what I thought of conspiracy theories. I said, they annoy me. I don't want conspiracy theories about life. I want factual, provable, logical answers to life's questions based on sound, tangible evidence. And I think what you're going to find tonight is that the Bible holds such answers for you. So why this dramatic announcement from Scott Morrison of such large-scale military spending whilst we're in the thick of a worldwide pandemic? Well, the government's not stupid. They've done it for a reason. You can see here, as the ABC reported, Scott Morrison has unveiled a more aggressive defence strategy aimed at countering the rise of China while warning that Australia faces regional challenges on a scale that has not been seen since World War II. You see, ever since World War II, we've lived in a world which has been governed and moderated somewhat by America. But in the last few years, we've started to see a decrease in the US involvement and policing of world affairs. And it's leading to a more fragile international scene. We're entering a very different world from the past 70 years. So, is war on the way? And if indeed it is, how big will it be? And who's it going to involve? So just a bit of an overview as to where we're headed tonight then. We're going to commence by looking at what the Bible says about the coming world war. Then we're going to also look at the Bible to find out how does this affect Australia and Britain in particular. And then we're going to step back for a moment and look at what's happening in the world around us from some of the news articles that have recently been released. Now, as this is a Bible-based meeting, we're going to open with a prayer, if you just remain seated where you are. Great God in heaven above, we come to Thee because Thou hast given us Thy word, the Bible, and in its pages Thou hast showed us things which are happening both in the world around us and things which will happen in the near future. Tonight, as we come to learn from Thy word what Thou hast told us about the coming world war, we ask that Thou would help us to understand it and to see world events in their correct perspective. We therefore commit this evening to Thy care, and we approach Thee in the name of Thy Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, the Bible is made up of 66 books. One of those books, the book of the prophet Ezekiel, contains a story that is pertinent to our discussion this evening. It is the story of a coming world war, a detailed portrayal of the Battle of Armageddon. Now, this is not some unrealistic tale of a cataclysmic rapture. This is the true description of real world events that God has predicted will happen. And this account is not alone in the Bible by any means. There's many references to the Battle of Armageddon. However, it is the most detailed prophecy of this battle, which is why we're going to look at it tonight. Now, this narrative in Ezekiel 38 was given to a man, obviously by the name of Ezekiel, who, as we mentioned a moment ago, was a prophet of God sent to the nation of Israel. He lived about 2,600 years ago, in around the year 600 BC. And Ezekiel was given many different visions, and this one in particular describes the final battle of the nations before God sets up his son as king over the whole world from Jerusalem. Now, the reason that we're looking at it tonight is because we're starting to see some of the events that Ezekiel 38 talks about happen in the world around us. A few times this year, I've just turned on the radio whilst driving to work and to or from work, and I've heard yet another puzzle piece fall into place as this or that world event occurs, which falls into place in Ezekiel 38. And so we're now going to have a look at what Ezekiel was told is going to happen by God. This world war begins at the heart of the earth, three of the Earth's continents, at the meeting point of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ezekiel 38 begins with a call to a powerful Russian leader to amass an army and to mount an invasion down to the south. The man we are introduced to is a formidable dictator. He originates from the land of Russia. He's going to head up a confederacy of nations, including France, Italy, Germany over in Western Europe, Ukraine and the Eastern European states, Turkey and Iran, as well as Ethiopia, Libya, and much of the North African continent. We're informed that he's going to mount an invasion south from Russia down into the land of Israel. This is the land that Ezekiel was given. Not that it was given, that he was born and bred in. And this Russian confederacy sweeps down through the land of Israel, conquering Israel and heading into Egypt as well. Ezekiel is then told that this ferocious, unstoppable army, which is portrayed like a storm, is going to be withstood by Saudi Arabia down to the southeast of Israel, backed by Britain and her allies, who will confront the Russian forces. And they'll ask, what do you think you're doing here? The Russian conqueror, Ezekiel tells us, is going to be in search of economic treasure. He'll loot the conquered lands and he'll carry his stolen goods back up to his northern homeland. But there's actually more to this invasion. It's not simply a money rampage. This is, in fact, a religious war. This is a clash of deep-rooted ideologies, belief systems from centuries of hostility. This is the invasion of a man who is deeply religious, heading up an army that's bound together by one common objective: to take the holy mountain, Jerusalem. This is the story of the conquest of the age-old city, Jerusalem, the city coveted by three of the world's oldest religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what exactly happens in this battle? And how does it end? And I didn't even mention Australia once there. How do we come into all of this? Well, in due course, we hope to find out. In fact, we're going to see that both Britain and Australia are identifiable in this ancient prophecy written 2,600 years ago. But before we launch into this story in Ezekiel 38, I just want to ask you a little question. If you were asked to predict a war between, say, Victoria and Queensland that's going to happen in 2 millennia, what names would you use to describe the people and the places that are going to be involved? You could either use some future names which relate to Victoria and Queensland, or you could use their current names. Now, the benefit of using future names is that it makes it extremely simple for anyone reading the prophecy in 2,000 years' time to know exactly who you're referring to. The downside is that in the lead-up, it means nothing to all of these people who's reading that prediction for 2,000 years, or the best part thereof. Whereas if we were to use their current names or their ancient names and leave it to future students to go and do their homework, then the prophecy holds meaning for everyone, both those who read it in 2,000 years' time, as well as for people right from our day. And that's exactly what God chooses to do here in Ezekiel 38. He chose ancient names, which we now have to search the history books to identify their locations on a modern map. And you may be aware that the Old Testament was actually written in Hebrew and then translated into English. So we're going to have to go to scholars of the Hebrew language, as well as ancient historians, to work out exactly who or what the names of these places in Ezekiel 38 refer to. Now, of course, we could spend all night doing that. There's many, many references you can go to, but tonight I really want to give you the big picture. So I'm just going to give you a summary of the evidence. And of course, you're welcome to get in touch with us later on and investigate it further. Tonight, we need to understand how this world war is going to work so that then we can see how Britain and Australia are going to be involved. So let's then start by reading the first 6 verses of Ezekiel chapter 38. I'm going to place them on the screen there for you. Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 1 to 6. And I've taken this from the New King James Version. Now the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man. So God is speaking to Ezekiel. And he says, Son of man, Ezekiel, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him and say, Thus says the Lord God. Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaws and lead you out and all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north, and all its troops. Many people are with you. Now, what on earth does all of that mean? Well, we're going to now step through and just break down those verses and identify who all these different people or places are in the first few verses of Ezekiel 38. So in verse 2, Ezekiel was introduced to the supreme commander of this confederacy. Now, how do you think Ezekiel could describe him 2,600 years ago that we would still understand today? Well, as you can see on the slide there, Ezekiel calls him the one at the top, the chief one, or in the Hebrew, the Gog. Gog in Ezekiel 38 verse 2 is a Hebrew word which means a mountain or something that's high, to cover, to surmount, or to be on top. So really, Gog here is at the top of this confederacy of nations. Now do notice that this word Gog is a title rather than a name here in Ezekiel 38. It's not telling us the name of the man who's going to lead this confederacy. It's simply telling us that he's the one at the top. So in Ezekiel 38 verse 2 we read, Son of man, set your face against the leader. the one at the top, who comes from the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Gog comes from the land of Magog. Now, where is the land of Magog? Well, Magog is an ancient name for the modern territory of southwestern Russia, the Ukraine, and the Eastern European territories. But how do we find that out from Ezekiel chapter 38? Well, we go to our history sources, and the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived around the 1st century AD, so almost 2,000 years ago, he gives us a really helpful start by telling us that Magog founded those that were called the Magogites, but who by the Greeks were called the Scythians. So Magog was the origin of the tribe of the Scythians. Now that's very helpful because all you need to do then is punch into Google, map of Scythians, and you'll get a little map, something like this. Now you can see here that the territory of Scythia covered the area just north of the Black and Caspian Seas in southern Russia. And this is confirmed by another historian, by H.G. Wells in The Outline of History, when he says that in the time of Herodotus, who lived about 500 years even further before Josephus, so we're now talking 400 BC, in the time of Herodotus, the Scythians were distributed over southern Russia. So Gog comes from the land of Magog, that is, southwestern Russia. So now we're going to add that to our map. Now, just whilst we're looking at the territory of Magog here, I mentioned before that we've got very ancient names that we have to deal with. And sometimes these are a little bit tricky. But what we also have to help us out is some timeless landmarks. And what you'll be able to see on the slide there is there's a very squiggly line on the bottom left-hand side of that territory of Magog. Now that's actually a river in Europe, which obviously is still there today. It's the river Danube. And another historian, a Russian historian, comments that at its greatest extent, the Scythian state stretched south of the Danube in its western flank. So we can search the various historical texts and we can actually work out where these different tribes lived in their respective areas. It's not always possible to map, in this case Magog, with 100% accuracy because some of the territories also overlap. But there on the screen we have the general area of Magog. But notice that Gog was not only from the land of Magog, he's also the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Well, where is Rosh? Gesenius, who's a Hebrew scholar, he comments that Rosh are undoubtedly the Russians who are mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name of Ros. Now, Gesenius wrote that approximately 200 years ago. And two scholars of Russian history confirm that this is a correct link. We've got George Vernadsky, who commented that the name Rus, or Ros, in southern Russia existed there from at least the 4th century. And then even one of the major rivers of Russia, called the Volga, which encircles the capital city of Moscow, that used to be called the Ros. And so now we can add Rosh to the map. And it's that area further east of Magog. It's that area of southern Russia. Well, he was also the prince of Meshech and Tubal. Where do Meshech and Tubal come into it? Well, on the screen there you can see a little snapshot that I've taken from one of these history sources. Of course, I'm quoting lots of different sources to find out where these different places are. And I just thought I'd include that just to show you what one of these Bible encyclopedias looks like. Now, if I zoom into the highlighted words there, we can see that Meshech is essentially always mentioned together with Tubal, and they inhabited the territory known as the Moskian Mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas. So again, we can head back to our map and we can find the... Oh, just killed my screen, there we go. We can find the Black and Caspian Seas, again down in southwestern Russia, and we can add Meshech and Tubal to the map there. Now the next few names are a lot more simple, and the reason for that is that they're still used commonly today. We're told in Ezekiel 38 and verse 5 that Persia, Ethiopia and Libya are also aligned with this man Gog. Now Persia is in fact the modern day country of Iran. I actually work with a lady who comes from Iran, and when I asked her, when I first met her, where she came from, she said Persia. Oh, and you might know that as Iran. So it's quite common to still talk about Iran as Persia these days. And here in Ezekiel 38, it includes the territory of Iran, but also further east, including the territories of Turkestan and Afghanistan. Similarly, Ethiopia and Libya are quite easy to work them out as well, because they still exist today. Ancient Ethiopia included the territory of modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. And Libya also refers to the current territory of Libya, but then further west along the North African continent. So again, we can add them to our map there. We've got Persia on the right-hand side, and then down the bottom and towards the left, we've got Ethiopia and Libya as well. And finally, we get to verse 6 of Ezekiel 38, where we find the last two parties in this big confederacy of nations. We have Gomer and the house of Togarmah. Now, Gomer is identified by the historian Josephus as being the tribe who settled in Gaul. Well, that's helpful. Where on earth is Gaul? Well, we can go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which tells us that Gaul is the region inhabited by the ancient Gauls, comprising modern-day France, parts of Belgium, Western Germany, and northern Italy. So if Magog was the territory of Eastern Europe, well, Gomer's going to complete Europe by adding Western Europe on the map there. Ezekiel's telling us that Russia has got all of Europe on side, as well as Iran and the area of Iraq there as well, and then down into Africa. And the last place that we've got to find out who they are is a place called Togarmah, the house of Togarmah from the far north. Now bear in mind that Ezekiel came from the land of Israel, so if I just jump back, you can see that Israel there is in the centre of the map, so we're expecting somewhere north of Israel. Well, Togarmah is identified by Gesenius, the Hebrew scholar there, as a northern nation which originated from the tribe of Gomer, but which travelled down to the area of Armenia, just north of Turkey. He continues that the Armenians themselves, nowadays, regard Togam, the son of Gomer, as the founder of their nation, and they call themselves the House of Togam, from which obviously you can derive the House of Togarmah. Now, other historians confirm this. I think it's one of the encyclopedias that we had on the screen before, McClintock and Strong. They say that the Jews say that by Togarmah, or the House of Togarmah, we are to understand the Turks. So now we can go back to our map, and we can add in the area of Armenia, which is on the northeastern end or corner of Turkey there, and the territory of Turkey itself. And so now what you can see on the map in front of you is this Russian-led military alliance described by the prophet Ezekiel 2,600 years ago. Now that is a powerful force converging at the centre of three continents. So now we need to work out from Ezekiel 38 who this army is invading. Well, in verse 8 we read that in the latter years, thou, Gog, shalt come down into the land that is brought back from the sword and gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel. So Russia here is invading the mountains of Israel. But notice that it's also described as the land that is brought back from the sword. Well, almost 2,000 years ago, if you go to the history books, you'll find that in the year AD 70, the land of Israel was invaded by the Romans. The Romans then took the Jews and they spread them across the then known world. And the Jews remained there, spread across the world, until only 72 years ago, when this happened in the year 1948. As a result of World War II, the nation of Israel was reformed, and newspapers all across the world captured the event, with this famous image on the screen coming from the Palestine Post as it announced the state of Israel was born. So Russia is going to come down and they're going to invade this land that's recently been regathered. They're going to invade the nation of Israel. And in verses 10 to 12 of Ezekiel 38, we're then told about the motive of this Russian invader. We're told why he wants to sweep south through the land. He's seeking a spoil and a prey. Gog wants money. Now, it may well be that he'll find this economic treasure in the gas and the oil fields which have been discovered off the western coast of the land of Israel. But why? Why is this world war going to be surrounding that tiny little nation of Israel? Surely Russia could invade somewhere else and get rich. Well, sure, Russia wants money. Sure, she also wants power. And as you can see on the screen there, Israel lies at the centre of 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. But there's more to it than that. We learn from other Old Testament prophecies that this is, in fact, a war of religion. Russia and Europe share Christianity in their age-old roots. Sure, they had a dispute about 1,000 years ago, which has resulted in a big rift, making the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, but the ties are gradually mending. And another prophet in the Old Testament, the prophet Joel, writes about this same war. He says that God is going to gather all the nations, which is what we're seeing here in Ezekiel 38. And then he says, proclaim this among the nations, prepare for a holy war. That's coming from Joel chapter 3 and verse 9. Excuse me. This is a religious war. Gog is motivated not only by greed and pride, he is also deeply entrenched in religious traditions. And that is why he wants the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the religious capital of the world. Don't believe me? Well, where is the leader of the Christians? So where did the leader of the Christians live, die, and ascend to heaven? Well, it was in Jerusalem. Where did the Islamic people say the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven from? Jerusalem. And what's the ancient capital of the religion of Judaism? Jerusalem. And that accounts for over half of the world's population. That's why Russia wants Jerusalem. You want to know how important religion is to Russia's current president, to Vladimir Putin? Well, look at this. Only a few months ago, on the 15th of June this year, 2020, Russia dedicated the main cathedral of the armed forces, a cathedral built specifically in less than 2 years to honour the Russian victory over Nazi Germany. And you can see there on that picture, in that picture on the screen, the military presence there inside the cathedral at its opening ceremony. Now, this cathedral is even designed to commemorate war. Its tallest dome is 75 metres tall, heralding the 75th anniversary from the victory of the Red Army over Nazi Germany. and it's 19.45 metres wide, commemorating the year of victory, 1945. But what's so interesting about this event is what the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church said at its opening ceremony. He said, "With this harmony between the might of the armed forces and the spiritual might of the church, of the spiritual and the material, of church and state, let the path of our people go into the future in peace and prosperity. And of this path, God willing, let there be new victories, new achievements, and no defeats." Fascinating. Russia is deeply religious, and so are her allies. And so, as the Bible predicts, Russia wants Jerusalem. But when she comes down, Gog and her army are met with an opposing force. The opposition is another group of nations who come up from the south. Now, you may well have guessed, this is where Britain and Australia are going to come into this prophecy in Ezekiel. The opposing nations are listed in verse 13. We have Sheba, Dedan, the merchants or traders of Tashish, with all the young lions thereof. Now, if those old names like Gomer and Magog were strange, what on earth are these names about? We've got two normal names, Sheba and Dedan. Then we've got a group of traders, followed by some animals. What is the vision trying to tell us? Well, let's go again to the history books. There's a number of different migration routes taken by the people of Sheba and Dedan, but most of the propositions end up with Sheba and Dedan occupying the territory of Saudi Arabia, as you can see on the screen there. Not just Saudi Arabia, but also the surrounding Gulf states. And after reviewing the literature, one commentator states that Sheba and Dedan points to the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. There's actually still evidence in Saudi Arabia today of the existence of Dedan. In fact, all you have to do is look up Dedan on something like Wikipedia, and you'll find that there's a town still in Saudi Arabia called Al-Ula, which is the ancient capital of the territory of Dedan. Well, next was mentioned the merchants of Tashish. Who is Tashish? Well, this is where we begin to unlock that first bit of our title. Because in the island of Great Britain, we find the modern equivalent of the ancient Tashish. Tashish is mentioned many times through the Bible, and so when we bring together all of the clues, we can form quite a comprehensive view or picture of who she is. I put a little summary of some of those references on the screen there for you, where we can see that Tashish is called an island in the Bible, in Psalm 72 verse 10. We also now know that she's renowned for her navy from Isaiah chapter 60. From the story of Jonah, we can deduce that Tashish lies to the west of Israel, because Jonah, when he was trying to run away from God, he got on a boat in Israel and he went to Tashish. And the only way you can go on a boat from Israel is to the west. We also know that Tashish was known for its trading. It was known in Ezekiel 27 as a merchant power. And you're probably starting to get a bit of a picture in your minds. We've got an island renowned for its navy, far west from the land of Israel, known as a trading power. Well, Britain is an island. She's certainly renowned for her navy. In fact, there was a song written called, or a poem, Britannia Rules the Waves. It was written in celebration of the vast exploration and expansion of the British Empire, including to the US, Australia and other lands. Without doubt, Britain is a maritime force. You can also see from that tiny little map that I'm putting up in the top right-hand corner there, that Britain lies to the west of Israel. Okay, but what about the last three clues on the screen? We've got that this power, Tashish, is represented by the symbol of a lion. We've also got from Ezekiel 27 that it's a source of tin, and finally that it will be in an alliance with Israel. Well, we're going to leave the first one for now. We're going to have a look at this idea of Tashish being a source of tin. Well, if we stay in the same book of Ezekiel and go just a few chapters earlier, we come to Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 12. And in Ezekiel 27 verse 12, as you can see on the screen there, we can see that Tashish traded in a number of metals, including silver, iron, tin and lead. Now, some of those metals were relatively common in the ancient world, but the problem with tin was that it was a very rare product and it was also a very important product. And this is observed by the metallurgist Roger Penhallerick. Now, he wrote a book about trading tin, and he writes, tin was a rare, highly prized metal, so vital to the developing civilization of the Bronze Age. And in bronze, there's a number of different metals, and in Israel they had all of them except for tin. This author continues, Cornwall in England was formerly the world's largest tin producer and is still the greatest in Europe. And he wrote that in, I think, 2008. The blurb of the book also tells us that Penhallerick studied the trade of tin in Cornwall from right back as far as 2000 BC. So we know that the island of Britain, or as I'm suggesting, Tashish, traded tin as far back as 2000 BC from history, and I'm going to say 2600 BC. Sorry, 600 BC. So 2,600 years ago from now, but 600 BC from the story of Ezekiel. Well, that's interesting. But what's really interesting is that last year, a discovery was made in Israel, which is fascinating given our story. The Times of Israel reported that scholars from around the world had carefully studied the tin which was used to make some of the bronze instruments in the land of Israel, and they'd worked out, by breaking down that metal, that it came from Cornwall and Devon in England. If you can look it up. They used different isotopes of the metal, and they identified that this tin in Israel must have come from Cornwall in England. So we know historically that Britain, ancient Tashish, traded tin with the land of Israel, matching perfectly with Ezekiel 27 and verse 12. That's another clue that falls into place with Britain being this power of Tashish. Now, the next one was that it was the mother to the young lions. So who are these young lions in Ezekiel chapter 38? Sheba and Dedan and all the merchants of Tashish, with all the young lions thereof, are going to oppose the Russian force. Well, Britain has long been depicted as the mother lion and the Commonwealth as her young lions. And these two posters, taken from one from the Imperial War Museum over in the UK and the other from the Australian War Memorial here in Australia, they depict Britain, the mother lion, calling out to the young lions to come and help them in World War I. But is this just a thing of the past? Is it just, an old depiction of the British Empire as the mother lion with all the Commonwealth as the young lions? Well, not at all. Here's just a few modern coat of arms from around the world. The first is from Australia. You can see there on the shield in Australia's coat of arms, that is a lion. You've got Canada's coat of arms, one of the supporters are a lion. And then even the city of Adelaide has its own coat of arms, including a lion. Now, I looked at that lion on the coat of arms from Adelaide and I thought, oh, bit of a strange looking lion, so I checked it up, and sure enough, Wikipedia comments that on the right side of the shield is a kangaroo, and on the left side, a lion. The line represents the English origin of the settlers who established South Australia. Now, I did find a few more reputable sources than Wikipedia that said that as well, but Wikipedia summarised it nicely. In fact, if you're in any doubt as to whether or not Australia is one of the young lions, well, if you're the owner of a passport, then in fact you belong to one of the countries of the young lions. Now, sorry if that's too small, but in the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner of your passport, if you're an Australian citizen, you will find that there is a little lion. And feel free to go up and look at the history as to where that lion comes from. So this identification of the young lions is something that we are seeing all across the world, Canada, Australia, and it still exists to this very day. The young lions in Ezekiel 38 verse 13 represent the Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and most likely also America, who originally came from Britain. And just like they did in World War I and II, these countries are going to respond to the call of the mother lion and join Britain and Saudi Arabia in opposing Gog, the chief commander of the Russian superpower. So now let's add all of that to our map. We're going to firstly put Egypt and Jordan in grey. The reason for that is that they're spoken about in other prophecies of the Bible. Egypt is going to be invaded by Russia, but Jordan's going to escape. We're going to add Britain there to the map, as well as the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, and they're both going to be aligned with Israel. Then we're going to put Israel on the map in yellow. This is the battleground. And when Russia comes down to invade Israel from the north, Saudi Arabia, backed by Britain and her allies, are going to oppose them. So now we know that Australia and Britain will be involved in the coming World War, and they're going to be aligned with the rest of the Commonwealth and will be in opposition to Russia, Europe, and much of the Muslim world, including Iran and Iraq. But what about China? Didn't the ABC say that Australia's increased military spending is in response to China? Well, yes, but the Bible simply doesn't tell us what's going to happen to China. We know from other Bible prophecies that they will be involved in the war because, for example, the last book of the Bible, Revelation, in chapter 16 says all nations will be involved in this world war. And by the way, Revelation 16 calls the war Armageddon. But the Bible doesn't tell us what China's exact moves are going to be. We just can't tell you whether China will attack Australia or not from a Bible perspective. But what we can say is that there's a good biblical case for Australia joining with the British forces in the Battle of Armageddon and fighting against Russia. Well, I think all of that is incredibly interesting. God has told us thousands of years ago that this was going to happen. And so now we can map out exactly what's going to happen in the near future. Now, I say it's the near future. Well, why is that? Well, because Ezekiel gives us some clues as to the timing when all of these events are going to happen. He says, "Thou shalt come up, thou Gog, shalt come up against my people Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days." Now notice two things. Firstly, it's the time period called the latter days. Now that's a phrase used through many different prophecies in the Bible to describe events which are happening in our times. We are well and truly in the latter days. And on the last slide of this presentation, at the end of the talk, I'm going to put up an email address. If you'd like more information on that, please feel free to get in touch with us. But suffice to say for now that we're in this time period of the latter days. And the other thing that we can see from this verse is that Gog's going to come down against the nation of Israel. Well, you'll recall from before, they've only been a nation again for 72 years. Before Israel came back to the land, they were scattered for 2,000 years, and this prophecy couldn't happen. But now it can. So everything's set. What are we seeing in the world around us that relates to this battle? Well, notice firstly from the map on the screen there that Britain and Europe are on different sides in this battle. Now that was impossible until on the 23rd of June 2016, just a few years ago, Britain voted to leave the European Union. Now that's an astounding move in terms of Bible prophecy. In fact, a number of Christadelphian Bible students predicted that this was actually going to happen based solely upon their reading of this prophecy here in Ezekiel 38. And here's just one example paragraph that I was reading the other day. It's written by a Christadelphian by the name of John Alfrey about 20 years ago. He said, this whole scenario would suggest that in the events depicted in Ezekiel 38 at the time of the end, Britain may well leave or be forced to leave the EU. And he was right. Or Ezekiel 38 was right. Okay, so Britain's left the red side. They're separated away from Russia and Europe. But now what we need to see is military ties building between Russia and her allies and Britain, Saudi Arabia and their allies. We could spend hours looking at all of the developments on these different alliances, but I just want to pick out a few of the most recent ones. In the last few years, we've seen Russia invade the Ukraine. We've seen Russia come down and invade the Crimea. We've seen Russia enter Syria to subdue ISIS, only to leave behind a few military bases down in Syria. Now, Syria is only just north of Israel. So Russia has been making some very interesting moves over the last few years. But there's been more happening than that. 2.5 months ago, the Washington Post put out this article entitled, Russia's ally in Libya is battered by defeats, but Moscow has wider goals to expand its influence. The article makes some most interesting observations. Russia, it says, is eager for oil and construction contracts in Libya, but the Kremlin's strategic objective, US military officials believe, is to secure some military bases on Europe's southern flank. One of their military analysts says Russia wants a foothold in Libya, and that's a fact. Well, that's exactly what Ezekiel 38 told us. Russia wants a foothold down in Africa, in the territory of Libya. You know, Russia also controls the gas taps to Europe. They have a great supply, a great portion of Europe's supply of gas. And if Russia wants to turn them off, well, then Europe freezes. So, bit by bit, we're seeing the alignment of Russia and the power of Russia spreading throughout those nations which are in red on that map of Ezekiel 38. Well, what about Britain, the Arabian Gulf states, and their allies? Well, of course, these are the nations who are going to defend Israel. So we'd also expect that these nations are going to have good relations with the land of Israel. Well, you can go onto Wikipedia and just search, for example, Israel-British relations, and it gives you a nice little summary of the different relationships between these countries. So I looked at a few of them, and regarding Britain and the Arab states, Wikipedia says, according to the British government, the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have long been close allies. So that's the UK, Tashish, and Saudi Arabia, or Sheba and Dedan. They are close allies. They've long been close allies. We're also told that the UAE and the UK relations have been described as a special relationship. What about Israel and the Arab states? Because Israel and the Arab states have not got on so well historically. Well, regarding Israel and Saudi Arabia, we're told that they don't have any official diplomatic relations. However, news reports have surfaced over the past few years indicating extensive behind-the-scenes diplomatic and intelligence cooperation between the two countries. So, to put it simply, Israel and Saudi Arabia get on pretty well, just not officially. Okay, another of the Arab Gulf states, the UAE. Israel-United Arab Emirates relations were formally established on the 13th of August 2020 when the United Arab Emirates recognised Israel as a state and the two countries established public diplomatic and economic relations. Now, do you just realise what you just read? Sorry, you probably didn't read it if it wasn't on the screen. Israel and the United Arab Emirates formally established their relations on the 13th of August this year. That's 3 days ago. They've signed an agreement to normalise relations that have been severed for over 25 years. You know, it was Friday morning this week. I'd just woken up, I was making a coffee, as you do. And every morning I get a little summary email with recent developments from the news. So I quickly scanned the headlines to see if there was anything significant, and I saw this title: Israel and the UAE reach peace deal brokered by the US. This is very significant. Currently, or at least in the recent past, you cannot even fly from the United Arab Emirates to Israel. Quite aside from the coronavirus restrictions, there were no direct flights from the UAE to Israel or in the reverse. In fact, I've tried to fly that, you can't. But what this signals is a landmark change in the attitude of the UAE towards Israel. And again, it's exactly what we would expect from Ezekiel 38. Those Arabian Gulf states, of which the United Arab Emirates is one, are going to get on really well, both with Britain and also with the land of Israel, who they're going to defend. Now, there's a lot more that we could say about the developing relationships between countries in harmony with Ezekiel 38. But I just want to share one last one with you tonight. Less than a week ago, the Wall Street Journal put out an article which here has been republished in the Australian Business Review, entitled, "Now is the time to revive the Anglosphere." Now, the Anglosphere is essentially the English-speaking world. And the essence of the article is summed up in its subtitle: Case mounts for the UK to form a new superpower union with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. That is Tashish and the Young Lions. The article could read, "Case mounts for Tashish to form a new superpower with the Young Lions." Britain, the mother lion, will form a superpower with her young lion allies. And if you want to look into that further, just write down CANZIT. It stands for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and I think the UK, that's right. Just write that down and go and have a look at that. It's absolutely fascinating what is happening in terms of the development of this alliance of the Anglosphere. Well, the article continues, today, with the further support of a galaxy of supportive countries such as Israel. Interesting, they're going to be supported by Israel, and India, and other of the Commonwealth countries, South Africa, Poland, Japan, and so on. The Anglosphere would be able to face down Russian, Chinese, Persian, or they say Iranian, North Korean, and other potential threats as we progress through this dangerous century. This is amazing in terms of fulfilling Bible prophecy, and it was written only a week ago. The Anglosphere is beginning to form. Saudi Arabia, Britain and her allies are beginning to form a tight alliance that will counter the Russian invasion. And so we have only one question left to answer, and that is, where does it all end? Well, the chapter concludes by telling us that God himself is going to conquer Gog. Whilst the British-Arabian alliance is going to oppose Russia, they're not going to be an adequate force to withstand the invasion. And so it's going to be left to God to destroy this Russian invader. Now, I realise that sounds completely outside of your realm of normal. It's hard to believe that God is going to stop this invasion. But it's like this. If Ezekiel could predict all of those events that we've looked at 2,600 years ago, and he could, we've seen that he could, if he could predict all of them and they're happening, then he can accurately predict the rest of the story. When Russia has invaded the land of Israel and the Arabian British forces fail to stop him, God says that he will intervene. Ezekiel 38 and verse 18 reads, "It will come to pass at the same time, when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face. Surely, in that day, there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, and I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God." So God is going to conquer Gog on the mountains of Israel. You know, other prophecies in the Bible tell us that Jesus Christ is going to come back to the earth, and he will conquer the Russian forces for God. Verse 22 continues, "I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and with bloodshed." Now, a pestilence is a disease or a plague. And if nothing else, this whole coronavirus pandemic is demonstrating just how easily God could use a virus or a similar disease to destabilize a nation or an army. So God says, I'm going to bring him to judgment with a pestilence and with bloodshed. And I'll rain down upon him and on his troops and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. You know, earlier in the chapter, the invasion of Gog was pictured as a massive storm rolling in upon the nation of Israel, and they can't stop it. And here God says, well, you invaded like a storm, I'm going to destroy you with a greater storm. And so God's going to use natural disasters to conquer this Russian force. You know, given that we're in Australia, the next chapter, Ezekiel 39, continues the same story, and it says there that God's going to send a fire into the distant islands who are living confidently. And that's quite interesting in the light of the fires earlier this year. But why? Why this whole battle? What's the point of such an incredibly large world war that God allows? Well, the chapter concludes, "So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord." But why does God do all of that just so that everyone can come to know about him? Well, the answer is quite simple. God claims in the Bible to have made every one of us. And he says that he wants us to come to know him, to develop a relationship with him. However, people, mankind in general, have decided to ignore him or to just worship him the way they want to. And so this battle of Armageddon is God's discipline. And by this immense display of might, he's going to cause everyone on the whole earth to know about him. And after he's done that, then he can show the care of a loving creator as he transforms this earth into a better place when Jesus Christ reigns as king from the city of Jerusalem. Now, the greater part of that story tonight seems pretty gloomy. And the reason for that is simply that tonight's subject was the coming world war, not the time of peace and safety that will follow. But just to leave you with a little taste of that wonderful time which will follow, I've selected just one Bible passage, and you'll no doubt recognise some of the language that comes out of Ezekiel 38. This is Isaiah chapter 2 and verses 2 to 4. In Isaiah chapter 2, another prophet from ancient Israel, Isaiah was told that it shall come to pass in the last days. Ezekiel's prophecy happened in the latter days. Well, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains. It shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. Instead of all nations being gathered for war, now all nations will go up to God's house, to the temple in Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many people. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that's the future, the other side of the coming world war. But I just want to leave you with one final quote this evening. Before he left this earth to ascend to heaven, Jesus Christ gave us an invitation. In John chapter 17 and verse 3, he told us that it is life eternal to know God and to know Jesus Christ, his Son. And friends, there isn't long to go. We've seen tonight that Bible prophecy is being fulfilled, and it's happening fast. And we've also seen that everyone on earth will shortly come to know God. And the question for each of us is, do we want to do it now, voluntarily, and be saved by God from the coming world judgments? Or do we want to wait until the other side of the coming world war?